Okay, let's just dive right in. For what feels like forever, the US-China trade relationship has been this raging storm of tariffs, threats, and just a ton of economic tension. And then, almost out of nowhere, a truce. A sudden calm that has left pretty much everyone asking, is this the actual end of the storm, or are we just in the eye of the hurricane? And that's a really great question, right? Because we're not talking about some tiny little policy adjustment here. We are talking about a massive U-turn away from what looks like a completely unavoidable economic collision between the world's two biggest economies. So what on earth changed? And this slide, wow, it just puts the scale of that change into perfect perspective. I mean, at the absolute peak of this thing, the combined tariff rate hit a mind-blowing 145%. That's the kind of number where trade basically just stops. And the truce? It brought that all the way down to 10%. That is a colossal shift, and we're going to break down exactly how we got here and what it all really means. So, to get the full picture, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the details of the truce itself. The calm. Then we'll hit rewind and look at the tariff blitz from the US and China's direct response. After that, we'll dig into the why, the deeper reasons this all kicked off, and we'll wrap up by looking at the ripple effects felt across the entire global economy.
All right, let's start with part one of our roadmap, the calm. We're going to look at the actual agreement that pulled both countries back from the brink.
So this agreement, which was hammered out in late October 2025, was actually pretty straightforward. Both sides agreed to slash those huge reciprocal tariffs down to 10% and keep them there for a year. The US also cut a separate 20% tariff in half. Now, in return, and this was a big deal, China made a major concession. They completely canceled their retaliatory tariffs on really critical US agricultural goods. It was a classic diplomatic give and take. But to really appreciate that calm, you have to understand the sheer intensity of the storm that came right before it. This wasn't some minor disagreement. It was a full-on tariff war, and it all started with a rapid-fire blitz from the US. And this timeline just perfectly captures the insane speed of it all. In just 1 week in April of 2025, what got nicknamed the Liberation Day tariffs went from just an idea to a full-blown reality, jumping from 34% to 84% and then to a staggering 125%. This wasn't a gradual ramp-up. It was an economic shockwave. And you've got to remember, those tariffs didn't just appear in a vacuum. No, they were stacked right on top of several other layers that were already in place. You had the big ones, Liberation Day and fentanyl, but also these long-standing Section 232 tariffs on things like steel and aluminum, and the really complex Section 301 tariffs on all sorts of different products. Altogether, it created this massive, complicated, and very expensive wall for goods coming from China. Now, as they say, it takes two to tango, and in a trade war, every move from the US was met with an immediate and very calculated reaction from Beijing. And this is the crucial part. China's response was almost a perfect mirror image. The US hit steel and aluminum, bam, China hits it right back. The US targets specific products, China retaliates against huge US exports like soybeans, natural gas, and cars. And you can see that last category there, the one that's crossed out, the tariffs on US agriculture, that's the key piece that just got canceled as part of this new truce.
The Liberation Day escalation is really the clearest example you can find. Back in April 2025, as the US jacked up its rates, China matched them step for step, going from 34% all the way up to 125%. This wasn't just a response. It was a powerful statement that China was willing to take the economic hit to match the pressure blow for blow.
Okay, so that covers the what. But now for the really big question. Why? Why did this happen in the first place? Because this was never just about trade deficits. The roots of this go much deeper, into these long-simmering frustrations with the entire global trading system itself. This quote is so important because it shows this problem is way bigger than any one president or political party. U.S. frustration with the World Trade Organization's appellate body, or AB, has been building for years across both sides of the aisle. The heart of the issue is this feeling that the WTO's system for settling disputes just isn't working for America anymore. And the number one complaint is this idea of judicial overreach. Basically, the U.S. has been arguing that the WTO's judges were acting like lawmakers, creating new rules instead of just interpreting the old ones. The feeling was that because the original WTO agreements are kind of vague in some places, These judges were filling in the blanks in ways that almost always went against U.S. interests. So what were these specific issues? Well, a huge one was something called trade remedies. Those are the tools the U.S. uses to fight what it considers unfair trade. The WTO kept ruling against the American method for calculating these duties. On top of that, there's a fundamental belief that the WTO rules were just never designed for a state-controlled, non-market economy like China's. And the real kicker? Because the WTO needs every single member to agree to change the rules, any kind of reform has been completely stuck in the mud. This brings us to a really fascinating economic theory that helps make sense of all this tension. It's called Rodrik's Trilemma. And the basic idea is that a country can't have hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and democracy all at the same time. You have to pick two. So just think about that choice. For decades, the world sprinted towards deep economic integration with things like the WTO. But according to this theory, that came at a cost. It weakened national sovereignty, things like the power to set your own trade laws, and it hurt democratic responsiveness because politicians felt they couldn't help voters who were being harmed by globalization. You can see the trade war as the US basically saying, okay, we're trying to get back some of that sovereignty and respond to our voters, even if it means weakening global integration. A fight of this magnitude was never going to be just about the US and China, right? The consequences have rippled out across the entire global economy, and the damage has been pretty significant. Analysis from the International Food Policy Research Institute paints a very clear picture. The US tariffs alone were projected to shrink the entire global GDP by 0.3%. But look what happens when other countries fight back. That tit-for-tat retaliation makes it worse for absolutely everyone, pushing the decline even further to 0.4%. It just goes to show how retaliation makes the economic pain so much worse. And for certain sectors, the impact is just brutal. Global agricultural trade, which is incredibly sensitive to tariffs, was projected to shrink by a painful 4.7% if a full retaliation scenario played out. That hurts farmers everywhere, messes up supply chains, and can drive up food prices for all of us. And this isn't just some abstract problem for economists to debate. This chart brings it right home. Over 95% of the agricultural chemicals the U.S. imports faced new tariffs. It's the same story for nearly 90% of our spices and coffee. These are costs that eventually find their way to businesses and to you and me, the consumers, far away from the halls of power in Washington or Beijing. So, this all brings us to the most important takeaway. This truce is a welcome relief for sure, but it's a band-aid, not a cure. The core problems that started this whole fire, the deep frustrations with the WTO, the clash between global rules and national power, and the challenge of how to deal with China's economy, all of that is still there, just simmering right below the surface. And that leaves us with the million-dollar question, or maybe the trillion-dollar question. This truce is temporary, but the deep structural problems that caused this trade war have been building for decades. So are we just in a temporary ceasefire? Are we destined to go through another round of this conflict when those fundamental disagreements boil over again? That right there is the question for the future of the entire global economy.